data facing. Oops, thanks. This is normally the data facing slot, but today we've invited the researcher facing track and the systems facing track to discuss all these changes with cloud storage licensing. I've brought my colleague Brian Kors from University of Michigan to talk about what they've been doing to handle some of this stuff. It'll be like part interview style, but part I'm one of the presenters because I was at University of Michigan for some of this. So I'll also be kind of attributing as well. But a few announcements before we get started. On the screen right now is just a little bit about our organization, the Campus Research Computing Consortium, or CARC. So it's kind of got two parts to it. There's the People Network, which is these monthly calls on different aspects of supporting research computing and data. And there's also working groups, which work on more project type things, like the capabilities model work group has been creating kind of a metric tool for institutions to judge their research computing and data services. And there are plenty of ways to get involved. You can join mailing lists, come to our events, and if you email get started or get involved at carc.org, we can give you more information. And we would love to see more folks participating in more things. And if you have an idea of your own, feel free to just email any of the emails. Like, this is a community group and it's volunteer based and also community driven. So that's a bit about CARC. Some announcements. We do have a code of conduct that is linked in the call doc. The link to that is being put into the chat occasionally to hopefully get everybody. And share real quick. And another exciting thing is this is a double feature that we're doing. So today is more of a presentation, and then we'll have a part 2, which is going to be more of a community discussion during the systems facing slot. That's April 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific and 1 p.m. Eastern. It'll be more of a discussion on, like, now that they're doing this, what do we do to move forward? And then also for the month of May, we're doing something a little different. Like, all the calls will be for all the tracks, and they'll be around accessibility for Accessibility Awareness Month in May. If you have ideas or speaker suggestions or anything like that, feel free to email any of the emails. There's so many emails for CARC. But with that, let's get into the talk. It's going to be more of an interview style than a presentation. So let's just get on with it. So let me see. Spotlight is for everyone, right? Yeah. So we'll spotlight Brian. Can I spotlight me? Cool. All right, I think it has both of us spotlighted. Perfect. All right, so welcome, Brian. Why don't you introduce yourself real quick for everyone?
Yeah, certainly. So my name's Brian Kors, and I am one of the collaboration service managers here at the University of Michigan. We are in the Ann Arbor campus location physically, but we also serve with many of the services that we provide, Michigan Medicine, so the healthcare aspect of things here at Michigan, as well as U of M Flint and U of M Dearborn in that respect. So my team and I, we manage things like Google Workspace, we managed Box, we manage Dropbox, Zoom, Slack, Microsoft 365 to some extent. So all of those things that have been very interesting and helpful over the past several years, given the pandemic and the shift to a lot of folks working remotely. So just looking through the list of folks here, it's great to be here. Deb, thanks for asking me to be here. I see a few familiar faces, particularly ones from my alma mater, Mr. Booth. Good to see you again. But yeah, Deb.
Cool. And I'll also introduce myself. I am Deb McCaffrey. I am currently at Arizona State University, but I was at University of Michigan for what we're going to talk about. And specifically, I was in Michigan Medicine. So as Brian mentioned, that's the academic medical school. So it was not just research and teaching, it was also a medical school and a hospital. We got to know each other through this massive project to move everybody from Box to Dropbox. So Brian, what exactly prompted the change from Box to Dropbox?
Yeah, so Deb, in regard to this, I think that was one of the first vendors who really started to announce that there were going to be some really big changes in regard to storage, how it was utilized, how it was billed for, and the fact that, you know, there may be some limits that are put in place that were previously not there. We decided after discussing things with not just Box, but the larger higher ed community of prominent Box using institutions, that we decided that we would shift away from Box and take an opportunity to move things to an alternate location as our contract was coming to an end, and which was time to make that shift. So
cool. And why was Dropbox chosen in particular?
yeah, so after, you know, I think, and this is kind of a trend, right? You have consumerization of services, right? So you have folks that started using Dropbox, you know, to share pictures with family or friends, or to do things outside of work, and people become very used to those services and those interfaces, and want to have similar experiences between home and work. And so we had a really big footprint of people that had been using Dropbox, albeit without an official university contract. And it gave us a moment to assess the options out there, and really take a listen to what faculty, staff, and students really wanted and preferred. And that's why we decided to shift over to Dropbox as the other location for a good part of this data.
Yeah, and what was the migration process, and what were some of the important decision points in designing it?
Yeah, so one of the things that we ended up doing, and I think it was helpful and beneficial to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, is we leveraged a self-service model, right? And so for a lot of these migrations, and I've been part of a few others in the past, it's basically you take this pile of stuff and you move it from this place to this place, right? With no significant paring down of data, or having end users really assess what they feel truly is important to retain and what probably isn't as important. And so we ended up working with a third-party vendor to help develop a self-service migration tool for folks to be able to go ahead and select specific dates that they would have their data migrated if they chose to do so. And so there were basically dates that opened up, and whoever came to schedule things, first come, first serve, they were able to schedule those migrations, have them complete in the background without them having to physically do anything other than schedule the date. And then they were notified once the data were moved over from Box to Dropbox. I think that really helped in regard to how much we had to move, right? The amount of data clearly determines a lot of things, right? So just physics in general. We had, Deb, if I recall, a bit over 2.3 petabytes of data that we needed to deal with, but we really only ended up migrating about a petabyte of data. And so that, I think, speaks to the fact that there are a lot of things that people feel they really, really do need. But then when given the opportunity to really assess that and take action, there was a lot smaller footprint than the full 2.3 that we had in place in Box.
Okay, and this, Scott, I see your question. I want to continue this thread before going back. Right, so Michigan built a migration tool. Is actually a very nice tool, in my opinion. It was very user-friendly. And they spent like a whole project like building a tool just for this. So Brian, and this might be a weird question considering Michigan's culture, but like, why help with the migration at all?
Yeah, so in regard to that, you know, we were kind of in an interesting spot where previous to Box, the only other service that we've had that has been cloud-based for a very long time is Google, right? And so pre-Google at Michigan, we were running our own IMAP servers, SMTP servers, right? Very just basic mail infrastructure. There was an Exchange platform, but not as heavily used as just simple IMAP and SMTP in that respect. And so we don't ever want to kind of leave people hung out to dry. We do feel it's important to meet our users in a space where we can help provide them options based on what is you know, appropriate in regard to data and where it needs to live. Obviously, the topic today is there's a lot of change going on. You know, what happens when unlimited becomes limited. And so we're doing our best to accommodate as much as we can, but in a way that there is attention to security and to meeting the needs of our community as much as we can, given the new guardrails that a lot of these vendors are putting in place.
Yeah. And then back to Scott's question, did historical security issues for Dropbox and other vendors play a role in evaluation of the new platform to switch to?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Scott. We have a great information assurance team here at Michigan that we run all of our negotiations for services through, and part of that is certainly a security evaluation, but then also particularly for sensitive data, and if they are to be stored in any of these services, you know, arrangements are made for things like, you know, data protection agreements, business associate agreements, right, to make sure that the vendors understand that they are liable if breaches happen and what they were responsible for and how quickly they need to inform us if things go awry on their end.
Yep. And thank you for pointing out there's more in the document. I am having trouble keeping eyes on everything. So another question here, what security ramifications, if any, did the change cause? I can answer that. So Box was our secure option. it was HIPAA aligned, it was FERPA aligned. And so moving to Dropbox, we made sure it had these same security alignments. So it didn't really have security ramifications as far as the users were concerned. It did have different technical bits that wasn't for the users. Let's see. And then how did you handle communications for all this?
Yeah, so we're really fortunate. We had two people on our team who are called PSAs, or performance support analysts, and they are really solely dedicated to doing things like the communication stream and change management of these kinds of projects. And so we're fortunate to be resourced to have those folks on our team. I think without those folks and that effort, we would have been in a lot worse shape with the project than we ended up turning out to be in that respect. We did a lot of targeted email based on a person's role, based on how much storage they were consuming. They may get one kind of message or another. We developed a website specific to the initiative. And then our folks engaged a lot with different campus communications channels. So there's a thing called the University Record, which is kind of a faculty staff facing publication. Michigan IT, which is a kind of an IT organization for all of the University of Michigan to talk about different topics and to announce news in that respect. So, but then also clearly, having leadership from the very top be involved in messaging and communications, not just in those more public venues, but things with IT advisory councils of all of the CIOs and various IT leaders across campus, making sure that there was an understanding and agreement there before moving forward on the larger project, I think was a key piece of it all. Deb, I don't know if you have any other insight or thoughts on that, but.
It was kind of interesting. I saw some of the reactions to these communications. Like, I got people who were appreciative of the advanced notice, but there were also people that were like, this is too much notice. Wait till you've figured stuff out more before telling us about this. So it was interesting. There was this interesting tension. It's like, yeah, it's great to know that this is being worked on, but it's like reminding us that it's being worked on and we don't have answers causes some anxiety too. Yeah. So
the other thing I think that really helped, Deb, and you were key in this as well, is not so much for end user communities, but for unit IT, for people that had to do support for researchers. We had a series of office hours for the project every week. And it was a time for people to basically just hop on to a Zoom session, get any new pertinent information that had evolved since the last time that we did those, and then gave them a chance to ask questions that others also had, that we were able to answer in a somewhat, I don't want to say informal, but a very conversational way. And I think not just in regard to getting information out and understanding the questions and concerns, but it actually, I think, really brought the entire community together, meaning not just ITS, but folks at Michigan Medicine, folks in the 19 different schools and colleges and units together, with an understanding that we were all in this together and that we were all working on it together as a larger team on the whole for the university.
Yep. And then what quotas and limits did Dropbox have, both on the institutional scale and the individual scale?
So for us, the way that we have things currently set with Dropbox is individuals have a very generous 5 terabytes of maximum storage as a me, right? my stuff in my own folders and my own account structure. We also have what are called Dropbox team folders, which essentially are kind of parallel to what a Google shared drive is, where it's for institutionally owned data. And so that's the we data, the me versus the we. And for currently, those are configured to be unlimited. And so far, we've been fine there. We also, I think one of the big things that's a difference between Google and Box or Google and Dropbox is that we do not allow alumni and retirees to retain their accounts for Dropbox, nor did we allow that for Box in that respect. And so we're seeing, certainly not as much overuse of things in that realm because of that, versus alumni accounts in Google, where we clearly have seen a lot of use in that respect.
Right. So trying to get back to our interview questions, what were some of the pain points of this migration caused by differences between Box and Dropbox?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, so one of the things that was difficult for us, and this was more in the way that Box had been deployed many years before I was part of the team, is we had kind of departmental accounts or shared accounts for Box that people were able to create, but they weren't really clearly documented very well in regard to exactly who created them or for what purpose. And so we had to do a lot of research using historic data that we received for requests for the accounts to be created, to who were the current owners of the accounts and co-owners of the accounts. And we were able to suss that out and put things into a good spot in that realm. The sharing is a little bit less granular in Dropbox than Box. But we have been able to kind of take a look at that, come up with best practices and advice on how to best structure things in Dropbox in regard to particularly Dropbox team folders, how to best share data using Dropbox team folders in that respect. So overall, I think the user experience, there were a lot of people that were really happy to move over to Dropbox. There were some that were not as happy, and those tended to be people that were using Box, I would say, across institutions. There had been some interesting challenges there, particularly like with Deb. I know that we worked together on situations where researchers were working with NIH on various things. So I would say really the pain points really were mostly in the granularity of sharing and being able to communicate to folks that it's not quite the same as it used to be. But overall, I think that's the largest challenge in that respect.
Cool. And then here's a bit where I came in. So we had to handle these large accounts, which we defined as greater than 5 terabytes. So they would exceed their quota if they used the migration tool to go to Dropbox. And my team in particular was contacted because the medical people were the big offenders. So I think, wasn't it like half of the accounts that needed migrating were med, half of the big accounts, I think?
Yeah. And in fact, and that's because Box was the only thing in this collaborative storage, cloud storage space that could be used with PHI, protected health information. And so that's why we ended up finding out that that was truly the case. And the other thing that I think was particularly interesting, Deb, as you are well aware, is while we are all Michigan, Michigan Medicine has its own interesting IT management and kind of community versus central campus. And even that being said, while there is a lot of centralized management, both within central IT and Michigan Medicine IT, there are still schools and colleges and units that are doing their own thing and that aren't part of that larger centralized environment. And so I think that was an interesting challenge as well in that respect.
Yeah. And just with the amount of data that we had to migrate from these accounts, we had to do something different. Like the migration tool wouldn't transfer fast enough, assuming that the transfer actually went through without any issues. So these folks, we had to do some white glove contacting to work out what to do about their data. And this was fun because my team, we're kind of the first line people that researchers talk to in the med school, just when they're starting a project and they need some tech, but they don't know exactly what they need, they usually contact us and my team. And a lot of the life and health sciences are big users of storage and not so much compute. So a lot of our engagements are just like, where do I store all this data? So this is something that we were already comfortable with. So we just applied that to these box conversations. And it was really fun because Brian, I remember you were very kind of intrigued by watching us work, and then you kind of took it to your own practices, which was very fun to see. But like the way these engagements kind of worked is we would talk very high level about what the data that was in box is and like what stage of the life cycle it's in. Is this active data you're currently working with? Is this archive data? How much of it is actually collaborative? So we just had that conversation with researchers and kind of determined high level, like where their data needed to go based on the functionality. So Michigan, being a pretty large school, has a bunch of options besides these cloud storage providers, which is very helpful. So at the time we had a tape archive for archive data. And we also have an Isilon NAS for active data. We also had a med school specific NAS as well that we could use. And kind of the decision between the med NAS and the central NAS was mostly where they needed to compute on their data. Was it on their med school computers or was it at the HPC center? So that was kind of that decision. And we usually only left the truly collaborative stuff between like different institutions in particular. Those were the ones that we tried to get into Dropbox. And most of the time that was less than 5 terabytes after everything had been moved to like our NASs and our tape archive. And luckily we did have one person on our team who does our clone magic and just made all the stuff go where it needed to. It was lovely.
I think the other thing, so the big questions that we were able to pull a list of all of the people that were what we called the big box users. For what I've termed the Boxodus project in hindsight. And so Deb and I and folks from our team, we would just schedule discussions with faculty members, right? And so And clearly, some of the questions are, is your data active or passive? Is it collaborative or is it not? Is the data sensitive or not? And if so, like what is the sensitivity level there, right, to help determine the better or more appropriate storage? We ran into all sorts of interesting cases. I saw a question, from Jim, was it tied to instruments or MRI things, kind of doing photography or imaging and automatically placing things in the box? And yes, we did come across various situations like that. We also just had people who, for example, were using their own NASs in their own offices. There was one researcher that had over 10 terabytes of data. And it's these conversations, these framing conversations and discovery conversations where you can learn, like, wow, okay, out of the 10 terabytes that you have, you're actually backing up like 7 terabytes of time machine backups from your Mac to the NAS and from the NAS to Box. Really not an intended use of Box. And honestly, if you tried to pull a time machine backup off of Box, it's not as easy as you might think, or potentially possible. So I think it was those framing conversations that really helped us understand, what are the best destinations for these data and how to get it there. One of the things that that I think was really helpful for us here at Michigan is we have what's called the Michigan Research Computing Package. And so it's something that is available to researchers in that respect. And it gives them a sizable footprint of storage of both kind of archival, deep storage. There also is an amount of more active storage that people can place things into, and it is just kind of part of what a researcher is eligible for and doesn't incur cost for either. And so I think having that as an opportunity for us to be able to put things that are more archival was really beneficial and something that was very helpful. Deb, I don't know if you have more on that at all, but
yes, just for the benefit of others on the call. So the way University of Michigan does their advanced computing services is it's all recharge. So the compute is on demand recharge, like with cloud, and then the storage, all the storage tiers have a monthly cost associated with them. So without any subsidies, like everything always costs money. But we realized it's hard for researchers to get and maintain funding for storage. So Michigan decided to just give all faculty a baseline amount of storage at no cost to kind of just help with the storage situation and just help everyone steward their data better. That was kind of the upside of all this, kind of making lemonade out of lemons, is a lot of these conversations turned into broader conversations about better data stewardship and data management for a lot of researchers, which was very exciting.
Yeah, and clearly the research computing package, and I put a link in there in the chat. There's 10 terabytes of replicated high performance storage, 100 terabytes of archival storage, and that's where kind of the longer term stuff, if there were retention needs of 7 years or whatever, that's really a more appropriate place for that kind of thing. And it also does include CPU hours of computing. But that was a huge benefit when we were looking to tease apart where stuff was from Box, and maybe and putting the truly collaborative stuff in Dropbox, but then the non-collaborative or maybe not as important data to access all of the time in more appropriate locations. And it was one of the things that I think was important is um, I didn't want people to feel like we were telling them they were being bad or they were doing something wrong, right? Because it was just the way things have always been. And so we really tried to frame things like, look, this is something that is changing, across the board. And it's not that you were a bad user and that you were doing things that were, intentionally wrong. It's just things have changed, and we need to figure out a better way to make this for better for everyone. There is a term that people have been using called data hygiene. I personally I'm not a huge fan of it because I feel like I don't want people to feel like I'm calling them dirty data users, but I think it's more about sustainable storage, right? And making sure that things are placed in places that are sustainable, data lifecycle wise, but even, carbon footprint wise, and thinking about that too.
Yep. Okay. There are so many questions, which is fantastic, but I need to manage time. So I think we'll kind of try to finish up with the pre-written questions real quick, and then start answering all the ones in the doc. So just real quick, kind of, how did this experience change how Michigan looks at these cloud storage services, and how is this informing the Google Workspace changes?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly this whole the limits of now on unlimited is a relatively new thing in the realm of the history of cloud and where we've been. So it clearly, we saw it with Box, where we see it now with Google, right? So I think a lot of it goes back to what I was just talking about in regard to, what are the most appropriate places given that vendors make changes to their services, and how can you best accommodate those changes, particularly when there are financial impacts, and at the same time try to meet the needs of faculty and staff and students in the best way that you can. So so in regard to changes about how we're looking at this in regard to Google, unfortunately, when Google went from limited storage, right? So it used to be, if I'm remembering properly, Google native files didn't incur a footprint in regard to storage, but any non-native Google files did. And there was a 30 gig, I want to say it was a 30 gig cap. And then Google announced that they were making storage unlimited, right? Unfortunately, they didn't put any rails in place for folks when they did that to put limits on, right? And so Google, I think, was really one of the first to do unlimited, and then others started to fall in line. And now we're starting to see everything kind of pull back, right? And so in regard to how we're dealing with this with Google, it's really given us an opportunity to look at our Google Workspace implementation and think more about the audiences and think more about quotas and appropriate quotas. And so we have announced quotas and we have put quotas in place. And I think that it's we've been able to do that in a way that is accommodating for the researchers and for faculty, staff, and students. We are fortunately able to continue to allow alumni and retirees to retain an account, albeit with a much smaller quota versus unlimited, right? We have also pulled back the ability for alumni and retirees to create shared drives, because that's something that really we're framing as being institutional storage rather than just anybody should be able to create those. And so it's given us an opportunity to really think more about what the very soon needs are in regard to Google and what we can do to make this more sustainable longer term.
Cool. All right. Now, questions in the docs. One I can answer real quick about was Box tied to instruments. There were some automations with the API that just kind of, they broke, and Dropbox's API is not very useful for research, unfortunately. We also had an interesting thing about API quotas, because one thing we tried to do when moving people is use the Globus Box connector, but the migration tool was using up like the API call quota, so the Google or the Globus connector didn't actually function. So that was, yeah, that was something to work around. I don't know how our clone person got around that. He just did magic and data was moved. Were quotas enabled by default? So for Dropbox, they were like, part of the migration was the individual accounts had the 5 terabytes on it already. That's why we had to intervene with these folks with above 5 terabytes. So how long is the contract with Dropbox? And do you have plans for what you will do if the product changes negatively at your next renewal?
Yeah, so we get questions like this because it is frustrating for everybody, right? When vendors make these changes, and typically they happen around renewal time. Overall, our experience with Dropbox has been great. I also know our leadership, and I don't disagree with this. I think the differences between a company like Box and Dropbox, they're really specific to storage, right? And Google does a lot more than just storage. So I think there is a more of a comfort level of with that being said. That being said, when someone says to me, well, how can you tell me that everything's going to be all right and nothing's going to change? We can't do that. So we always state that we will do our best to meet folks where they need to be and to help them with these larger vendor changes. But we really have to be able to adjust the services when vendors make very large decisions that affect not just our institution, but institutions and the general public across the board. So
yeah, so how long did this whole migration take from first planning to no one has data on Box?
Wow, it feels like it was 10 years ago. I want to say it was a couple years. In that respect, we ended up making our quote end of service date much earlier than our end of contract, so that we were able to have some additional months to iron out any particular issues that we ran into in that respect. So that was very good in that regard. And I would say we didn't have too much stuff at the end that was an issue that we needed to clean up. But I would say if you are looking to do a large migration project like this, that you do have some contingency time in there, particularly to deal with things that may change, particularly since you aren't running the hardware and vendors can make changes mid-project on you as well. So.
Yep.
And yes, Jim, I see your comment. We don't want to all get boxed again. I have heard that as well. So.
Yep. And just a note on kind of like what the end is. So even after the Box contract ended, there's this weird bit where Michigan folks couldn't create a personal Box account with their Michigan credentials for what was it, 6 months? Something like that. That was weird. That's where we got into some messiness with the NIH, because some of their processes require using Box, and our researchers couldn't use their Michigan emails to make Box accounts, even like personal ones, which was a big headache. So that was a weird thing.
Yeah, and that's all tied to the licensing and enterprise agreements and what have you. So we've since gone past that 6-month period. I think what's interesting is, and this is not something we can control, because it's a larger question of what happens when you have a service that you do have an agreement for that goes away, and then people are able to use it again. And because there are some challenges there and some concerns, right? Like not everybody is clearly aware that there's sensitive data or what those sensitivities are, right? And so it really, we frame it out in regard to the use of what are called personal accounts, or non-enterprise accounts at Michigan, and we clearly have guidance as to what people should and should not be doing with said accounts. So it's interesting, with Dropbox, it was not a service that people could use for sensitive data, and now it is. And Box, it's kind of the other way around now. So.
All right, and then I think there's only 3 more questions left, unless I missed one in the chat. But I can take the next 3. So how do we talk to them about active versus passive data? So, right, researchers, timescales are all over the place. So the way we would usually describe active is just the data you're actively analyzing and accessing, like on a daily basis. Whereas passive data is the stuff you're not accessing that often. It's probably the stuff that's already published, or stuff that didn't work that you're probably not going to publish, and stuff that you just wouldn't access regularly. So that's usually how we described it. And we kind of let them run with it from there. For subatomic physics, I cannot speak to that. I don't know if you can speak to subatomic physics specifically, Brian, but for folks with like lots and lots of data, like way more than 10 terabytes. So the way that the med school would handle that is they would just have to pay above the 10 terabytes. And if it was like extreme large data sets, like we have Michigan has a researcher who's might be generating exabytes per run of his instrument. That's like, we have a whole cost sharing agreement and talk to NIH regularly and all that stuff. So that's kind of, you have to deal with that on its own. All my data is active.
We've heard that.
Yeah, we just like, when they tell you that, you just have to question them more. It's like, really? I mean, if you want to count it all active and pay for like 50 terabytes more, fine, but that's probably not what you need. And the way the way we came up with the 10 terabytes, that actually started with the med school. We were the first ones to try out this program, and then the university adopted it from the med school. The 10 terabytes is roughly an amount that will satisfy 80% of researchers. The med school designs a lot of its services around 80%, 15%, 5%. So like 80% is what you provide at no cost. 15% is like you add a cost for more stuff. So that's where if you go over the 10 terabytes, you start paying for extra storage. And then the 5% are those one-off people who just need like their own thing. And then regarding combining these 10 terabyte allocations, we did not like give them one combined volume just because it would get messy. The volumes are owned by faculty. And if you combined two of them, like two faculty own it, what happens when one of them decides they don't want to collaborate anymore? How do you unjoin that volume? We just decided we don't want to deal with that. So it's just only the 10 terabyte volumes. And that's not an issue because they can just make sure both volumes have the same access group. The only place where it would run into an issue is if you had a file larger than 10 terabytes. But we'd definitely be asking some questions if that was the case. So that's just kind of what people what people just have to deal with because it gets messy.
And then one thing I wanted to mention, and I do see in the comments, data retention, things like that. And one of the interesting things that we are seeing with this change at the industry is, when you have data retention policies and everything is all good where it has been forever, and changes happen, and all of a sudden a bunch of data need to be moved for a grant or a project that no longer has funding. That those are some big challenges that are a lot of times uncomfortable, right? And so we've been doing our best to make sure that vendors understand in higher ed that's a thing, and to make sure that they're aware of that in that respect. So
cool. And I see one more thing that kind of came up in the notes, like these gray areas around active and passive data. Is it worth paying for the storage space? How does the decision either way align with institutional data retention policies? I think that would be a great question to save until part 2, which will just be an open discussion. I have lots of thoughts on some of that. It's just we don't have time to get to the rest. But those are the questions that we as a community need to help researchers answer and guide them through. Yep. So any other last quick questions or specific to Michigan questions? That looks like a no.
okay.
Well, thanks for being here, everybody. It's great. When is part 2? Part 2 is during the regular system spacing slot, which is April 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So, and we should have added it to like all the tracks individual calendars. So like if you're on the data facing track, you should have gotten this invitation as well. So, but if you do not have it, feel free to email your respective coordinators and they'd be happy to get you the information. It is going to use the same Zoom as this, which will help. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.